Hi, my name is Anthony. Welcome to my presentation on clean energy and environmental sociology. Our first subject is government, specifically regarding misinformation. Many government officials themselves are the origins of misinformation regarding clean energy, which in turn damages the public perception of these cleaner energy sources. Although ignorance can be attributed to part of it, there is more oil companies lobbying the government than ever before, which cannot be a coincidence. The social consequences of such misinformation leads many to make misinformed choices regarding support for clean energy or things like vaccinations even. Ecological consequences: lack of proper support for investment in cleaner energy sources to prevent things like BP's massive oil spills from continuing to happen. As for protective regulations, currently a major worry in Minnesota is the rumors of the boundary waters being targeted for things like mining and other resource extractions. The government's jobs are to enact legislation that protects the environment and its impacts on citizens. However, through lobbying, officials often, even more so now, act on behalf of their corporate act on behalf of corporations rather than their constituents. The social consequences uh, without protective regulations uh, provided by government, factories will continue to pollute the communities they operate in, which has negative impact on health outcomes of people living in those communities. That pollution also has negative effects on the environment and the wildlife living on it. As for incentives and land allocation, while increasing, the incentives our government offers for adopting clean energy methods, especially on the individual level, is abysmal when compared to our European counterparts. A lack of rebates or tax credits does not help to encourage the switch to clean energy and meet our climate goals. Another contributor is the lack of investment, lack of investment in proper land allocations for energy sources. Solar panel fields take up many acres of land. Other countries have found other success using things like carports or rooftops to fit solar panels on. As for the social consequences of improper incentives or land allocation, it shifts a lot of the financial burden to the average citizen and makes the transition to clean energy way less feasible, especially in a time where much of the lower and middle classes are struggling due to things like inflation or a lot of things. Ecological consequences: using open land for solar panels and like their fields threatens to be yet another thing to take away from land that could be returned to nature or used elsewise, like things like housing. Moving on to corporate concerns. This time, environmental disasters is the focus. Corporations, particularly oil companies, are almost solely responsible for disasters such as oil spills that happen in the ocean. They seem to treat it as a cost of doing business, simple, and pay the fines as they come. The consequences do not outweigh the financial incentives to do so. That's why companies such as BP are racking in record profits even though they've committed multiple infractions that led to oil spill disasters, causing vast amounts of wildlife death. A transition to clean energy might rid ourselves of energy companies so apathetic to the environmental impact that they cause. The social consequences of the environmental disasters. One could include they contaminate food, and they also deplete, say, a fisherman's livelihood. There's also concern about the health issues due to exposure to toxic substances by being near things like corporations or their manufacturing processes. Ecological consequences. One could include these oil spills can also devastate the ecosystems themselves, leading to die-offs with things like coral reefs or just wildlife or marine life in general. More obviously, is a more obviously carbon contributors. Corporations are by far the biggest contributors of carbon emissions. Though industries like manufacturing, or through industries like manufacturing and agriculture, the emissions generated by corporations are detrimental to climate to the threat of climate change and its growing impact on the health of humans and wildlife across the world. If corporations could be incentivized to invest into clean energy sources power to power their operations, such as manufacturing, they could greatly cut down on their emission output. The social consequences of these contributions. The emissions produced by corporations pollute the air, which can lead to respiratory issues such as asthma or cardiovascular disease, particularly affecting populations living nearby to these manufacturing plants or whatever you will. Ecological consequences. These emissions worsen climate change, leading to habitat loss and worsen weather patterns and of course threatens biodiversity itself. Greenwashing is when corporations deliberately misrepresent themselves as being environmentally sound and responsible by means of PR campaigns while not actually aligning with said responsibility in practice. They do this virtue signaling in effort to mislead customers about their priorities and their commitments to the environment. By educating consumers, we can ensure they see through the misleading and work to hold the companies accountable. The social consequences of greenwashing could include it lowers public perception or trust of genuine efforts made by corporations that aren't actually misleading. The ecological consequences could include misleading efforts tend to delay meaningful environmental action, allowing harmful corporate practices to simply continue to go unchecked. It also diverts attention and resources away from more effective solutions. On the individual's end, one issue is the carbon footprint of very wealthy or the ultra wealthy, and the carbon footprint that their lifestyles tend to leave behind. For example, the frequent air travel, the often less efficient vehicles, the large properties, the unused vacation homes are all ways that the ultra rich contribute more to emissions than the lower classes, even with much less people in their class. They also individuals and ignorance and apathy can also contribute. For example, it's common for consumers to choose single-use batteries over rechargeables simply out of convenience of having to charge these batteries. It's just simply easier to put in new ones. Individuals can also contribute by being ignorant or lacking education on many environmental issues. So lack of education leads people to think that windmills kills birds due to misinformation disseminated by politicians. The social consequences of apathy could be a lack of collective action, hindering meaningful progress on climate change and environmental protection. This action fosters an unsustainable consumption patterns, weakens public support for policy change, and delays the necessary shifts towards a more sustainable future. Consequences ecologically of apathy include accelerated habitat destruction, and small actions add up to large-scale environmental destructions, contributes to climate change, ecosystem collapse, and depletion of natural resources, which threaten vital ecosystems. As for other causes, clean energy costs, there is also the issue of clean energy itself requiring emissions to manufacture. For example, solar panels and windmills also have high manufacturing costs that generate greenhouse gases. Also, cause for concern is they also carry the extra burden of requiring rare metals to be used, leading to further mining and environmental impacts on resource extraction. Social consequences of clean energy costs. The initial cost of clean energy can burden communities by requiring significant investments in infrastructure and technology. Ecological consequence could include land use for clean energy is also a concern. With the habitat loss becoming more common, it could put another strain on land resources. There is also the environmental costs of mining for materials used in renewable energy technologies. Lastly, I'll address the discrepancies in access to this clean energy. Due to initial investment, as well as other factors, has seen rural and poor communities fall behind in adopting clean energy methods compared to wealthy or urban communities. Adopting clean energy has proven to be more challenging in rural areas. Greater support for clean energy is also necessary for further investment of infrastructure in the communities struggling with access. Social consequences of these discrepancies is they worsen social inequalities by leaving marginalized communities vulnerable to the effects of this climate change, such as rising energy costs. Ecological consequences, continued reliance on fossil fuels lead to continued carbon emissions, further polluting the environment. And that'll be all for my presentation. Here's my references.